First off, I want to thank the brave men and women who work behind the wall. I want to thank them on a national level because their job goes unrecognized.
How do they try to turn a guard?
Well, correctional officer. Sorry, I apologize. But correctional officer.
How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. So we're going to continue our discussion on the coronavirus. This is probably our fourth video, I believe, we're doing. So we've been giving out a lot of updates. I think today what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a lot of the frontline concerns. So we have obviously some supervisors here from custody. We also have a gentleman from the One Voice Initiative. We'll introduce him shortly. And we also have Connie Alleyne, who will be mentioning or talking about the civilian side of things, which is great too. So, and obviously we're going to be talking about the medical side of things. So I think this is a discussion that is definitely needed because there's a lot of concerns. But before we go into our discussion, I would like to see if we can get everybody introduced to the table. So obviously, I would like to think you know me by now, Anthony Gangi. Hopefully you do. If not, welcome to my channel. And if you enjoy it, please subscribe, like, do whatever you got to do. And we all should know Russ. Russ, do you mind introducing yourself again to the audience?
Yeah, my name is Russ Hamilton. I run a Facebook site called Keepers of Chaos for training knowledge and history for correctional personnel of all types. I have 27 years in with California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Started at San Quentin around 1989. Retired now, but I came out of retirement briefly a few years ago to work at a juvenile detention facility in Northern California. And now I just try and partner with Anthony as much as I can and see what's going on over there at Tier Talk, because Tier Talk is where it's at.
Yeah, you know what? I just want to give a dedication real quick. I'm going to dedicate this episode to Russ's mom. Had a great conversation with her. She is also a correctional professional. She was a correctional officer. So was Russ's father as well. I believe Russ comes from a family of correctional officers. Correct, Russ?
Yeah, my mom was an officer. My dad was a fire captain for CAL FIRE. And the last years of his life, he ran an inmate work crew on fires in Northern California.
So why don't we dedicate this episode to the Hamiltons?
I'm down for it, but
Yeah,
mostly for my mom.
Your mother's a wonderful woman, and she shows great support to the show. And we did make a promise that in a few months, Russ is going to be interviewing her, and he's going to be putting her on this venue. And I would be honored. I think that's going to be a show that I'm really looking forward to seeing, and just I'd be honored to distribute that, Russ. I really
would be great, man.
Okay, Connie, do you mind introducing yourself to my audience again, please?
My name is Connie Alleyne. I'm the founder and president of the Civilian Corrections Academy. Essentially, we offer resources to civilian employees who are entering the correctional environment, or those who are there who just need to sharpen their skills to stay safe and have a successful career. I spent 10 years at Rikers Island as a health services manager and another 5 years in the Connecticut Department of Corrections as a prison health services administrator. I have a master's in public health, and so that kind of helps me to sort of navigate a lot of the issues that come forward and be a resource to the staff when they're concerned about, am I going to get sick by this happening?
Well, I'll tell you something, Connie, that's something we should not overlook. So it's good that you said those credentials.
Yes.
That's why we need you. We're relying a lot on you because we have some tough questions for you today, Connie. So I think it's going to be.
All right, I'll try my best.
Well, that's why I have you. You always give us the best. And yep. Andy Potter. So guys, Andy Potter is new to our venue. I met him out in Oklahoma when we were at an event that we're honoring basically our heroes who made some made sacrifices, or some actually stepped up when the job asked for it and they did what they could above and beyond. And Andy Potter is the founder for the One Voice Initiative. It's basically an initiative to bring our voices together, the front line, both officers and civilians. And if ever there was a time to bring that voice together, it would be now. And Andy, do you mind introducing yourself to the audience and kind of breaking down what the One Voice Initiative is?
Yeah, so my name's Andy Potter. I've been in and around the Department of Corrections in Michigan for about 30 years. Most of that was as a corrections officer, and I'm the executive director for Michigan Corrections Organization, as well as the founder of One Voice. And just as Anthony said, One Voice is really about bringing corrections staff, frontline staff, and civilians from around the United States together as an industry to paint our voices back into the conversation around criminal justice and criminal justice reform, and where innovation works and where it's dangerous. We should be able to call out both of those things. Sometimes things work well, and sometimes they put us in danger, and we should be able to voice our opinions there collectively as an industry instead of trying to achieve that on a state-by-state base. So that's what One Voice Initiative is really about, is bringing those voices together and injecting those back into the conversation so we have a seat at the table, so we can be considered stakeholders once again. We're the second largest stakeholder in that conversation around criminal justice reform. So I think that we have a place at the table. And as we all know, if you're not at the table, you're what's served on top of the table. So that's really what that initiative is about. And thanks for having me. I appreciate joining.
It's going to be a great dialogue. Now, guys, we have a lot to discuss today. Again, we're going to be focusing on the front line, their concerns. And I think this is a topic that definitely needs to be discussed because, as we know, the threat is getting greater. I'm not going to exaggerate the threat. I'm not the media. But, you know, it is entering into our facilities. I'll give you some breakdowns of where we're at now. And then we're going to go ahead and talk about those concerns. But again, we'll do that when we come back from our sponsor. Now, guys, if you haven't, the show Tier Talks for you, brave men and women that work in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. We're going to go to our sponsor. When we come back, we're going to discuss the coronavirus and how we can protect our front line. So stand by.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it, it's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
Guys, Inmate Manipulation is a course that is highly needed. It's the process that's so slow moving and subtle that you don't realize it's happening. When inmates choose to manipulate, they manipulate our need to react. Situational awareness and insight is going to save your career. It's going to save you from doing foolish things. Listen to your gut. So the more insight we have, the more we can recognize what isn't so overt, and we can correct our behavior before we fall into a trap that we can't get out of. If you allow an inmate to pull you out of your prescribed role, you are opening up a door for a host of problems. Inmate Manipulation, the psychology behind inmate manipulation. Available now. Link in description. And we are back. Hey guys, before we go into the dialogue, I do want to say, just as an update, there are 3 more Department of Correction officers that have tested positive for the coronavirus at Rikers. They've also quarantined, I believe, 8 inmates. So just a quick discussion on this. 3 Departments of Correction officers have tested positive for coronavirus. This was today on Thursday. 1 of the 3 officers has been hospitalized, another is asymptomatic, and the status of the 3rd officer is unclear. Also announced Thursday is that at least 8 inmates have been separated from Rikers population because of coronavirus-like symptoms. So I'll tell you something right now, the union's all on top of that. Elias Hussamuddin, they were having meetings today about COVID, and he's pushing for the protection of his officers, of his staff, and he's very highly concerned. And that's what kind of motivated me to let's get this discussion in play. Let's basically see what it is that we could do better for the front line. Or if we're not able to accommodate, then maybe we can explain why those accommodations can't be made. And just real quick, Bergen County Jail, that's a jail that's very close to me. It's probably about 20 minutes from my house. They actually have an officer that tested positive for the coronavirus, and there's 7 others under self-quarantine. A correctional officer at the Bergen County Jail tested presumptive positive for the coronavirus, leading 7 co-workers to self-quarantine as well. So, I mean, you know, this is very close to home. I know Patterson, my neighborhood, we just doubled. We had I think it was like 4, now we're up to 9. So our cases are increasing too. So, it's scary. We're just hoping that people listen, they stay indoors. We can find a way to neutralize it. But I know Russ was doing some research, so Russ does have some good news for us. But real quick, and I'll start with Andy first, because Andy's going to kind of be able to broaden discussion here. But so when you found out about this epidemic, obviously right off the bat, you're going to be worried about staff in general. Like, how is this going to affect our front line, both our correctional officers and our civilian staff? So what are some of the concerns that are coming your way? And also, there's a survey that you put out that I put on my community board. Guys, so if you get a chance, please go to my community board on my YouTube channel to take the survey. But what is the importance of that survey as well?
Well, it's important because, as we all know, unless we are asking ourselves these questions and unless we can lift those answers up and say those loud and clear in a lot of different circles, and I travel in a lot of different correction circles, so everything I say and do through one voice is all informed through the staff around the United States, all through corrections officers. And I don't speak about things on a national level unless I know that's how most of the folks around the United States feel they work inside of correctional facilities. I'm not one of these folks that are just hired as a talking head. I want to speak for those officers when they can't speak for themselves. So it's super important that we hear from everybody, take the survey. I encourage you, please. I know my president in Michigan Corrections, MCO, Michigan Corrections Organization, he's going to push it out for our officers to take. And in his words, this is a time and place, if there ever was one, that we've got to bring those voices together. And this survey is going to help us do that.
So what are some of the concerns that's coming your way right now with the coronavirus?
Well, the first concern is that I don't think they have all of us in the best interest here. I think they expect us all to march in there. You're going to hear about disciplinaries and everything else because we're going to have officers that are going to want to try to protect themselves, that are going to go in, try to do the job like we always do. We're on the front lines and we're going to be in these prisons. But we know when coronavirus gets inside of those prisons, it's going to run rampant. And at some point, they're going to start locking those places down. So our concern right away in Michigan was that when we line up to come in, they take our temperature and stuff. They go through a little screening process, and those aren't always accurate. And so they send us home, and they make us use our own sick leave and things. And then we have to report back the next day. And sometimes the next day when you report back, you screen okay, and they let you inside the prison. And for us, that doesn't seem like a very safe measure, number one. And number two, they're making all of us use all of our sick leave. And some folks at some point run out of sick leave, and then they're in lost time. Then they're getting disciplinary. And so some of those are some of our upfront concerns, not to mention just being inside of a prison with bad ventilation, close quarters, overcrowding, understaffed, and they expect us to be inside of there trying to protect, trying to keep people healthy and safe, when I don't think they're doing enough to listen to us about how the operation should take place in order for us to stay safe. We're not brought to the table as stakeholders in this, and they're not paying close attention to some of the things that we have to say as frontline staff.
I got a message today from an officer who had a doctor's note to wear a mask for the coronavirus, came to work with the mask. He was told repeatedly not to wear the mask. And then eventually he just, after keeping on wearing it, he basically was sent home by his supervisor. So I'm going to go with Russ on this one first. Russ, what's your thoughts on if you had an officer that wanted to wear a mask? What's your thoughts if they should be allowed or not? But I want to kind of keep this perspective, like, I know we have the safety of staff, but I want to also take it from management side too. I want to see if we could try to understand their perspective as to why they wouldn't want the officer wearing the mask. So we're looking at just a roundabout perspective. So as a supervisor, what are the pros and cons right now that you would see with someone wearing that mask?
Okay, so the first thing that kind of jumps to my mind in a situation like that is that for whatever reason, it sounds to me like this particular facility or whatever is catering to the inmates, but they've catered to them in a way that they haven't bothered to inform and enlighten them as to why a particular person might be wearing a mask. The only reason for someone to wear a mask has come from the outside is to protect the inmates. So for me, that's a failure there. The second thing that I'll say is that me as a supervisor, I'm never going to override a doctor's note. So whatever else that means, if I have to find a position for that individual outside or whatever to try and comply with that, I'm going to do it. But I'm certainly not going to try and undertake some kind of disciplinary measure because I'm telling them to go against doctor's advice. I don't make enough money to do that.
Now, hey, Russ, on the other side of that, though, would you think, just to kind of put it out there to keep things balanced, do you think there would be security concerns wearing the mask? And at any point, would those security concerns be superseded by medical concerns?
You know, I don't see in most situations that it would be a concern. As far as wearing a mask, we tend to know people by their gait, by their stride, by the fact that we always have a partner, or we should always have a partner close by that can do something like that. If he had to remove the mask for some kind of identification purposes or something, he could certainly do that. What I'm really concerned is I'm concerned that this particular facility, not everyone's on the same page. Not everyone has thought every permutation and probability through. And so I think that what they need to do is they need to figure out why that individual shouldn't be wearing a mask and not come up with some specious security concern or something. Although there may be something there that I don't know about. But what they should be thinking about is how they can accommodate this individual and how they can do better to inform the inmates. I was talking to someone, I don't think it's the same particular facility, and it appeared to me that admin's big concern was that the inmates were getting upset that an individual was wearing a mask. And they were all about, well, where's our masks? Well, they don't need them because we're coming from the outside. That barrier is there to protect them. So I don't know. I just feel like it's a failure of communication, and it's a failure of adopting and looking through the right policies and developing good policies that are going to, cater to some of these specific special needs that are going to crop up here and there.
And you know what, Russ, I agree with you because we discussed on the show yesterday, we talked about, like, let's say we had limited supply of masks. Now, in this case here, the officer brought his own mask. Okay, fine. But let's say we had a limited supply of masks. Who would we give it to? Would we give it to the officers and the inmates? And we all agreed it would be the officers. It would be the staff members, the civilian staff, because they're coming from the outside. And again, the threat's coming from the outside. So you protect the inmates by putting the mask on the officer. Now, from a medical perspective, Connie, do you think the masks are okay for the officers to wear if they needed to?
I think that if there is a doctor's note that has prescribed a mask, that there's no way that medical note would be superseded unless there was something that says that officer or that employee was not fit for duty. The mask doesn't say they're not fit for duty, so I can't imagine that they would be prohibited from wearing the mask. I think one concern may come because you now have this one officer wearing a mask. What is the perception? Is the perception that that officer is infected and that could cause some sort of hysteria? I could see the concern raised from that perspective. As far as, and I guess the other concern could be if you allow this one officer to wear the mask, if everyone else comes in wearing their own masks, would we allow that to be, without having to violate any of that officer's HIPAA rights? Is it enough to say there's a medical documentation to support this officer wearing a mask, as opposed to everyone else who may want to simply follow suit and wear a mask to protect themselves?
Yeah, because I know that when I was reading his messages, I kind of I understood both ways, but I was leaning towards the officer only because in my mind, I still feel that the mask protects the population more than it does the individual. And not what I'm talking about is like you're wearing the mask because the threat's coming from the outside. Like we had an inmate that was testing hot and they were coming through intake. The first thing we do is we put a mask on them anyway. So I think the universal precaution is if you had enough masks or if people want to wear masks coming in, I really don't see the problem with that because that adds to another level of defense. We have the scanning methods, we have the extra cleaning, the education of the population. By the way, if they started seeing staff wearing these masks, obviously we would have to make sure that the inmates understood why that's happening. And I will guarantee you that will be twisted by the media. I will guarantee you the use of masks would be twisted by the families who are getting stuff from the media. But we would have to go back and balance that by going back to the population and saying, hey, listen, we have to explain why these masks are being worn. And I believe for the most part, these inmates would pick up on that and they would accept that. But unfortunately, we don't have control of all the media. All we can do is try to control, the pandemonium that they tend to cause most of the time. Hey, Connie, I want to ask you another question that came up the other day. A lot of people are still asking about the quarantining of officers or staff in general because, again, we were talking about either the threat being so great that you have to quarantine staff because, again, you don't want something coming in, or like Russ mentioned, just being severely understaffed where, you may have to kind of just close the gates and just kind of deal with the staff you have. But one of the things we were talking about was also quarantine the unit. Let me ask you a question. Let's say I was an officer and I saw a few inmates that could have symptoms. They're sneezing, they're, look a little feverish. So we expect our staff to be proactive. We want our staff to not wait for the inmate to come to them. We would want the staff to say, hey, listen, we need medical to either come to the unit or can we send the inmate to medical? I'll figure that out. But if the staff member is talking to the inmate, now, we don't know that the inmate has anything, but they're showing signs that they could have something. When does the officer have to get quarantined? Do they have to get quarantined before the positive for the coronavirus from the inmate, or do we wait till that test becomes final?
I mean, I think you would want to take the step that would reduce the possibility. So you're better off erring on the side of caution as opposed to allowing the officer to kind of just go out and possibly infect other people. I mean, it's like worst case scenario, but when you've gotten to a point where you've decided to quarantine, essentially you are saying that you have to remove this threat, and the officer doesn't not become a threat. He's part of that threat if he's been exposed.
Because it seems like, from what I'm reading now, is that it looks like they wait for the confirmation to see if someone does have coronavirus, as opposed to the universal precaution where I got a person with symptoms. While we're waiting for this person to be tested, let me go ahead and send the people home that had contact with that individual. But I don't know if they're doing that. I think what they're doing now is they're waiting for the confirmation. And then what happens is that while you're waiting for the confirmation, if this person is like, holy crap, he does have it, you could have these other people in the unit for 5, 6 days, 7 days, just, roaming around. I mean,
Right. That doesn't seem to me to be the most clinically appropriate decision to make. I would assume that decision may be driven by staffing requirements, staffing minimums, staffing needs. If you decide to start letting people go home, how do you maintain that staffing requirement that you need? I mean, bad enough that you already see this tilt of there being more inmates than officers or more inmates than employees, just in general. And so what do we do in those instances where you are requiring people to go home? Like there was an incident that I read about in Tallahassee, Florida, where not only did they not have enough masks, soaps, or hand sanitizer, but their only doctor was out sick. And so what do you do when that happens, right? If you don't have the bandwidth within the system in order to shift doctors or medical support or even officers from one facility to another where you see there is the potential of a threat, you leave your entire population vulnerable. So what they ended up doing was they had a new inmate come in on a Monday who was immediately quarantined because he had a high temperature. Tuesday, they had a dozen inmates come in from U.S. Immigration and Customs, who they had to then quarantine as well. And so now you're trying to shift staff to be in a space where they can kind of keep an eye on this quarantined population, but then that creates more of a divide. How do you not make sure you protect those staff that you've now put on the front line with offenders who are possibly positive? It's creating a whole lot.
Yeah, it's becoming hard because there's the medical, but then there's also the safety and security, and I feel there's a bit of a conflict there. But at that point, it's like, medical may supersede some levels of safety and security. I understand that, especially when it comes to, I got an officer that's really sick. I can't just leave them on the unit, even though I need the coverage for that unit.
Right.
Hey, what would you prefer, Andy? So if you had, an officer, they're being proactive. They see some inmates on their wings that are kind of, going through fevers. We don't know what it is yet. Could be the flu, could be allergies. And what we do is we go ahead and go get the inmates tested. But while we get the inmate tested, before it's finalized to see what they have, what would you like to see have happen with the officer?
Well, I mean, ideally, that officer should be pulled off the rock, and he should be placed someplace where if he doesn't have something, he isn't going to get something, but he should be tested so he's not moving that virus around. Look, it's a pandemic, and this thing has been proven to move pretty swiftly, pretty quickly, from very little contact. I don't know that anybody really has the answers here, Anthony. Connie seems to have a pretty good handle on how she would approach it, which I commend her for. But I'm not confident that in this kind of situation that the states, I'm not confident in our government, I'm not confident in a whole lot of policymakers that they've got answers about how they're going to approach this or how they're going to handle the state of a correctional facility anywhere. Because everywhere I talk to folks, they're understaffed, overcrowded, and they're in a situation that has conditions that aren't set up for success for anybody. So, and as well as I know, that at the end of the day, who's going to lose out the most? It's going to be those officers. That narrative, it was set a long time ago, and we're behind the walls. Nobody sees us very much. They don't get a chance to hear from us, the public or otherwise. And we're the ones ultimately that are going to have to clean up a mess as well. I still say that there hasn't been enough proactive measures bringing officers into this conversation to say, look, we've got a problem, and we're going to need every one of you to help us sort out how we approach this, not just in a managerial style, but in a custody, on the ground, boots on the ground, in the trenches. How are we going to handle this if it starts to get out of hand? There should be something more than a protocol that comes down from an office somewhere else in the middle of a city that tells officers how they're going to handle this. I just don't think that we're as prepared as we should be. And part of that problem is they haven't been talking to officers and frontline staff, supervisors or otherwise, enough to get a handle on it.
Right, and you know what's funny? As we discuss this, it's actually good that we get these questions out there, because I'm sure, first off, some people are thinking about this already. That's why we're doing it. But also there's some that may not be thinking about it. So for the states that are going through it, we should know what their procedures are, because we may need to follow suit when it happens at our facility. Because me and Russ have been going crazy reading what's going on at the other facilities to see how they're reacting and kind of understanding the do's and don'ts. And I think one of the concerns that me and Russ were considering was, when do they decide to quarantine those that have been exposed? We wait for the confirmation, or do we just go ahead and act on universal precaution? But like you mentioned, the biggest concern is, and I'll pass this over to you, Russ, as a supervisor, was the biggest concern right now they have is that well, we'll be quarantining people for people that just have the flu and stuff, and our staffing is going to be short. But technically, I understand that. But what about on universal precaution if it is the coronavirus, Russ? I mean, what would be your thoughts on that, Russ?
I would just have to go to what the default position is as it's handed down by the CDC. And, there has to be something that backstops all of our actions from a viewpoint of, liability and safety. So I haven't looked at and haven't seen everything that everyone's produced out there with regards to their policies and procedures. It seems like it's kind of a hodgepodge. I think that the best thing that they can do is say that, okay, if someone's running a fever beyond, whatever arbitrary number, 99, then they go home. If they have any kind of a fever plus, one symptom or two symptoms or whatever, then they go and they're going to have to get cleared somewhere. Now, what the medical parts of those facilities or those departments should be doing is they should be expediting tests for those individuals so that if they don't have the coronavirus, they can come back as expeditiously as possible to help start filling in those gaps again. And this is really a matter of fine-tuning things and having those administrators on the front line trying to make these decisions. It appears that at some facilities, especially maybe at some county level jails and things, that they're not thinking the process all the way through. They're simply being reactive instead of proactive. They're not getting ahead of the problem. They're getting behind it. And once you get there, all you can ever do is play catch up. So I think that they just need to, start really using those critical thinking skills and, start putting these measures in place so that they have a firm grasp on what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Because right now it's just like, Chinese fire drill.
I'm going to ask a very tough question, but I want to get the perspectives out there because somebody's thinking this. So I want to ask, and I actually would like to get the perspective of all three of you. This is a tough question, but I want to ask it, and I think it would be great to see what you guys think. But basically, at this point, because what we have going on, should we just lock down the facility? The staff that's there is there. You rotate them and just kind of keep them secured with the population. Because again, the threat, if just something leaks in at this point, it's pandemonium. And for a lot of people, they think the answer is, just lock it down, cut down to the bare essentials, and just rotate the staff that's there so you eliminate the threat until this passes. So what's your thought on that? What's your thoughts on that first, Russ? And then we'll go to Andy and then Connie.
I'm just at a loss for the way that that it appears that we don't have anything nationwide hanging in place for this stuff. It just seems like we have a bunch of things that are cobbled together at various state and local levels, and we're not getting enough direction, and enough policies and ideas put in place that we can all look to. Instead, it's just being cobbled together as we go.
Go ahead, Andy.
Well, I just think anytime, over my time in corrections, anytime something big, and this is the biggest thing I can remember in my lifetime happening that's going to affect as many people as it will, and it doesn't matter who you are, you're equally affected in some fashion. So, but usually the first reactions are the wrong ones. And it's going to take a minute to sort this out and to start figuring out what the right actions are. That's typically what happens. But I mean, if you think about it, corrections officers aren't going to be able to just go home and self-isolate. We're going to have to get this figured out. And it seems like they should be starting to think about, I'm a forecaster. I believe in forecasting out what happens, especially in corrections, and the way it's going to look. And I can tell you, the way this is set up and the way we're heading right now, this is the worst recipe I've seen that could be predicted, to be honest with you. These corrections officers are gonna, we've already had some infected, and when it gets in those prisons, we've seen how scabies can go through a prison. We've seen how norovirus can go through a prison, and we've seen MRSA and other things. But this is something much different than that. And so these officers don't have a choice, and they don't have anywhere to go if they are affected. What are they going to do? Go home to their families now? We've got to figure out a place that they can go and self-isolate and get the right kind of medical attention. Otherwise, what do you think is going to happen very quickly? I hate to even have that conversation, to be honest with you, but we have to wake up to some of this, I think.
Well, Connie, just to kind of reiterate the question, do you think, if the threat becomes so great, do you think the best benefit is really to just lock down the facility, rotate the staff that's in there, and just try to would that be an effort to protect both staff and the population until this thing passes?
I mean, I think it's a viable option. I just don't know that it's the most effective option. Because I feel that you can't. So it's one thing to think about the disease transmission. I think it's another thing to think about the impact that being locked down in the facility will have on the staff that are there. We can't ignore the fact that that would be removing them from their families completely. So they will be in isolation. We can't ignore the fact that many staff do have underlying health conditions that they may not necessarily be bringing forward because that's their right. And so how do we bring them in and somehow expect them to neglect their own personal needs because we want to keep things safe? Now, I get it. It makes sense that if you have the same people in place who are kind of rotating through, they understand what the post orders are, they understand what the appropriate response is to whatever is going to be happening. But I just don't know that that's the most effective way. Now, if it had to happen, the only thing I could think of is if you created like a unit that's just for staff, like not necessarily like a housing unit, but like, is there an area where there would be cots and food and everything else that staff needs in order to maintain their own peace of mind, that they can get rest in between shifts and they can go back and, but still you're asking them to be the point person for the front line of possibly coming in contact with this infection.
The reason why I mentioned that was I was reading an article. This comes from Courier Mail. And once it opens, hold on, it's not open. Hold on. I want to make sure it opens. But basically, the article is saying that prison staff face sleeping next door to inmates. So basically, they're trying to keep the staff close so they're available. I guess they're preparing for, I don't know if it's going to be people just getting sick or just basically they're preparing for, they need to keep the facility operating just to have the staff members there. But we've been cutting things, as I said, down to bare minimum. You can see across the country that volunteers, visitors, programming, religious services, I mean, everything being cut down to the bare essentials, minimum staffing, even for the essential the departments, so minimum staffing for food service and custody. They're really trying to eliminate the traffic that is going in. I mean, it's these preventive measures, but we were mentioning before that, all these preventive measures, you still got that person that can come in that's asymptomatic, that is going to get past the screening, that's going to be just floating around. And I think, we do have those preventive measures, but we have to prepare for the inevitable that someone is going to come in, they're going to enter the facility, and now it's, what are we going to do? So I think a lot of people are putting their mind to the fact that we can prevent this, and don't worry, it's not going to happen in my facility. But as you can see it across the country, it's happening in every facility. I can see you nodding your head in agreement. What's your thoughts on that, Andy?
I just think you're right. I think there's a reality to this. And if we can come to grips with kind of what that reality might be, we should be coming together and saying, this is what we expect out of this. And we should be trying to put forward a message in some fashion that says, this is what we as staff are going to have in order for this to work. And the problem is nobody's coming to us. We're going to have to do this on our own, Anthony. You know, in some ways, we're in a place right now where it's just starting. This is where we got to start planning and getting serious about how we handle this, not long after it's already hit a whole bunch of our brothers and sisters out there and we're trying to pick up pieces, because that's going to be too late. And God forbid, right? I think we have to take some lessons from what's already happened in the world, in other countries as well, with the way some things were handled. I just think right now, there is no blueprint for this. It's a pandemic, and the authorities can do a lot of different things with staff when it comes to something like this in an emergency situations. We all know that. We've been through emergency situations, and staff always step up. They're always there, no matter how mad they are, how pissed off they are, and how much time they stay away from their families. We come in those gates, we come through those doors, and we lock elbows. No matter how mad we are at each other, we lock those elbows, because that's what we do. But right now is the time where we got to start formulating how we're going to address this. Connie, I think your wisdom and insight is clearly important here, as well as a lot of healthcare staff. It just seems like we should all be coming together to say, hey, look, let's not overlook this and approach this on a day-by-day basis, because every single day this thing changes. And every single day I wake up and I hear something else that's worse than the day before.
When we're going through something novel, we have to immediately establish a chain of command. I mean, that's right off the bat. You're going to respond to a riot. You got to have a chain of command. There's got to be somebody that's got to be able to make stuff happen. If not, you're going to have a complete scramble. And there also has to be an end game. There has to be an end game. Like when we start responding and reacting to, let's say the possible chance that we have to quarantine and move people, is there any chance that what custody is going to do or will conflict with medical, or what medical wants to do is going to conflict with custody? So I think we're kind of on the same page here where, is there going to be concerns where we're just in conflict with each other? So right off the bat, I'll go to Russ first, because Russ has dealt with this before. Russ, I'm thinking right off the bat, first thing you need to do is when you have these concerns, because don't forget, even riots, you can have policies, but the problem here is that each riot creates different circumstances that it's going to cause you to deviate from policy, but there'll be an effort to kind of bring things back to policy. So the one thing I would like to say is you want to give someone the leadership you want to give someone a leadership position that's able to know policy, but be able to adapt and adjust and bring things back to policy. You really need someone that really knows their way around, especially just has the ability to maneuver through unique situations. So right off the bat, Russ, the importance of establishing a leadership position, even in a riot situation, any novel situation, is paramount, correct? Like, who takes control at this point? Is it custody? Is it medical? And we have to be clear of who takes control at that point. At this point, this goes to custody. At this point, this goes to medical, and we try to maintain a working partnership. But sometimes when you have that working partnership, some people still, custody's got to do it this way. No, medical's got to do it this way, and then we're not going nowhere. So you have to establish who has a level of control and over what they have a control of. Correct, Russ?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that you're looking at here too, as we get deeper and deeper into this thing, there's administration is going to have to start looking at things like succession of leadership. What happens if we have an entire panel of administrators that are all at that point where they're too sick to function? By this time into it, hopefully those lines of succession are clear so that they can delegate that downward to whoever's going to step in and fill that space. Now, as far as it gets to on the tactical level, what places should be doing by now is they should be in that prevent defense mode. They have to start thinking about ways that they're going to prevent these things like riots and stuff from happening. This is going to where you're going to have things like alternating yards, alternating blackout days. Maybe you're going to run yard longer, but maybe you're also going to make sure that you have fewer inmates out so that when these things happen, you can deal with them effectively. This is why, you know, the brain trust that you've got up there with regards to the administrators is so important. And, you know, hopefully people are thinking this through and going, okay, what happens if the administrators get sick? And then what happens if the next level, who can we call in to maybe, you know, fill that exterior perimeter? I mean, is the National Guard an option? Or what about, you know, if you have access to other law enforcement organizations, maybe they can help take up some of that. They're not trained to go to the inside, but, you know, maybe they can man a tower or a post perimeter or a gate or something like that. And hopefully all of these things, all of these policies, procedures, and tactics that I'm talking about, hopefully people have thought them through. Hopefully before even this, hopefully there's a plan sitting somewhere that someone can pull off the shelf and dust it off and look and see what it says.
See, I think what the public's not aware of right now is the fact that we have the best professionals that are going to be able to handle this from the front line. Trust and believe that. But they're not handling it in the best of circumstances. The layout is horrible. You know, I wish we just had the solutions where we could put people here. We don't have that. So we're scrambling and we're making changes and moving people around, but in the process, still maintaining safety and security, still talking to classification, still talking to custody, and just, you know, it's like we don't just have the freedom to move people as we want. You know, I wish we did, because then we wouldn't need to have this dialogue. The fact is that we have to react within the parameters of what we're allowed to do, and that's when the experts come in. That's when, you know, custody comes in. That's when medical comes in, and they're able to maneuver around those parameters. But yes, there's going to be some level at first where we're scrambling, but I know right off the bat that they're going to be able to figure it through, but it takes time. But I will say in the process, they have to look confident when they're doing it, though, because if at any time they don't look confident, you know, the inmates are going to see that, other staff's going to see that, and it's just going to be hard to maintain that level of control. Now, before I get to Andy, I don't want to leave Andy, because I know he's going to have bad weather. But Andy, is there something you want to comment on when it comes to the custody versus medical perspective?
Yeah, I just think, you know, many times in the past, there's folks inside of a prison that sometimes do this: custody, clinical, not to mention just the tension between the inmates and the officers. But I will just tell you this: what started One Voice was a riot in Michigan over the food. It was a private food vendor, and the officers really went out on a limb. They took pictures of some pretty gross things and said, look, it ain't right. You shouldn't be feeding people this. It's going to have problems. It's going to cause us problems. And it did. It was a riot. And not one officer was hurt. Now, a lot of them, of course, were shook up. And it was unbelievably tense. And there was a lot of stuff going on in there that those officers talked about. But the one thing they said was, look, we advocated. They understood that. There's two folks in there that are going to be affected the most, other than healthcare, of course, and that's line staff and those inmates. Now they need to know that none of this is punitive. The things that we're going to have to do to maintain order and to maintain safety, it's not punitive. But we can't have a message sent that we're just locking down and we're doing this and we're going to take away your yard, take away your visits, because I don't know that that's clear, because nobody communicates and nobody tells us that that's the message that's sent. They just see us, the line staff, taking stuff away. And that's what their families see as well. In these cases, I know that there's some wardens out there that are having a lot of conversations with the inmates and the inmates groups, the wardens forums and stuff like that. I have not heard of any wardens that have brought a group of people together and say, look, we're going to be facing some stuff and we got to figure this out. You know, we used to have tornado drills and everything else many years ago when I first started, and we ended up in a basement of a unit with 120 inmates and 3 officers. And very rarely, there was occasions, of course, because that's just the deal. But we all knew that this was going to hit all of us. So it behooved all of us to get it figured out in a way that made sense. And I haven't heard of those kinds of conversations going on, really. I've just heard of just what we're doing. We're brainstorming right now. But a lot of our brainstorming is because there's no sharing of information about how this is what's gonna happen, how this is gonna take place, what's the order of things. In a riot, we do have alert response teams and others that come in and give us backup and give us reinforcement. And there is law enforcement that circle that perimeter. That's when everybody does seem to come together, is in the clench. But there needs to be some more stuff up front, not the after the fact kind of armchair quarterback and stuff.
Yeah, you're right. I noticed that when we do the reactionary measures, and Connie would be able to fill in on this too, is that once you're able to explain to staff and also to the population of what's the procedure is going to be, that explanation carries a lot of weight. Trust and believe that, because if you talk to those inmates that represent those tiers, those units, they go back and they filter the information out, and then there's less pandemonium, and they kind of police each other. But my biggest concern is that, and it was like what me and Russ were talking about prior too, is that if you don't know when each department supersedes the next, like if I know that this happens, okay, this is custody. I know when this happens, this is medical. I know when this happens, this is them working together. You're going to be scrambling right now. So I know the biggest thing right now is to develop some form of understanding of when each department takes control. And Connie, the question I have for you in scenarios like this, or just in scenarios of infectious diseases, kind of piggybacking off the question I asked Russ, was, do you see any potential conflicts between custody and medical if we don't establish who takes priority at certain times?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't imagine that there's some sort of medical crisis and someone who's not the most qualified to handle the situation would be in control of it. I think that that's why it's more important that there is a partnership and there's this open communication up front so that people know what to expect as they walk into the situation. Yes, there are times I think where egos come into play, and that it happens. It's a reality. The doctor doesn't want custody telling them anything, right? But I feel like the other side of it is that there's a respect for the expertise of the medical staff, and that they are probably more equipped or better equipped to handle a particular situation. And that does not mean it should be handled in isolation. It's something that should be handled with the custody team, as opposed to it being a one-sided thing.
Connie, I want to ask one more question, because we can start rounding it out. But the other concerns I'm getting is really, when do you decide that you have to quarantine the whole unit, which could include the frontline staff members, or, let's just do this, for example. Let me run a scenario by you. Let's say I'm working a dorm. Got, whatever it is, 16 inmates to a wing, whatever it is, right? And I have a few inmates that are presenting symptoms, right? But we don't know what it is yet. We don't know. So do I call for medical? Does medical come to the unit first, or do I send those inmates out to medical? So that's the first thing. How do you determine when you're going to come to the unit or when we can send the inmates to you?
So, well, at first, I think there has to be a discussion as to how long did you see the inmate or know of the inmate having these symptoms? Because then you can kind of rule some things out, like, okay, well, it could just be a common cough. It could be, it could be anything that you could rule out immediately. But if someone can say, well, it's been about 8 days that this inmate's been coughing, and you know that the inmate has been exposed to X amount of folks in the tier, I believe medical would be going down to the unit to do the test, any testing on the offender. Usually if there is a designated day room or somewhere where they could actually have a dialogue without violating their HIPAA rights, we're able to do it that way. But ultimately, if there are significant findings, there would be conversation with the unit officer as well as whoever is the next in command that should be made aware that, we've had this finding in the unit.
Okay, so the basic question is, because I know it comes up as the concern is, when are we going to be quarantining that unit? So if you have, does it go by the number of inmates? So if I called the unit, if I called you up and you're working medical and I said, hey, listen, I got about 5 inmates showing symptoms here. Do you want them to fill out a triage and you'll see them in the infirmary, or do you want to come to the unit and whatever protective gear you got to come with? I mean, would you want me to have those inmates fill out a triage and you get to them when you can, or are you going to come to the unit at that point?
I mean, at this stage, you would want to go to the unit at that point. And also it depends on, do you have the ability to isolate those inmates in a medical unit, right, safely? So if you had the capacity in medical where there were 5 available rooms, for example, then you would feel safer saying, well, you can bring them and then we can observe them in medical. But if you don't have that capacity and you just brought them into medical where they might be now sort of presenting with their signs or symptoms while we have truly sick patients in the unit, that creates an even more disastrous situation. So we're better off going into the housing unit, doing the assessment in there, and then making the determination of what the next steps would be.
And Connie, one other question too, being that a lot of people have limited supplies, are you going to wear protective gear every time you go to one of those calls, or?
I believe that's a necessity. That's not a luxury, because you've got to think you're going to those calls, you wear the protective gear, and before you step back in the unit, you should be discarding that possibly contaminated gear.
Yeah, because I know right now the concern is that we're limited on gear, and we're trying to, a lot of the nation is trying to figure out, like they got the influenza, the allergies, you could be wearing gear, and it turns out it's just an allergy attack, because, really the first initial look is from custody, who may not have the medical background to kind of tell the difference between what could be allergies, what could be the flu, and what could be the coronavirus. And someone even mentioned about having the nurses tour the units daily. I'm not a big fan of that because they're going to get overwhelmed by inmates. I think the inmates are going to just overwhelm them. But what's your thoughts on having nurses? First of all, there's not enough staffing, but even if there was enough staffing, would you recommend that?
I was about to say, I don't think you have enough staff to be able to do that. I think that if in fact we're just trying to be vigilant and making sure that we identify things sooner than later, it may be a precautionary measure for us to take. I don't know for sure that I actually know it's probably not a sustainable consideration. But I think from a space of us being proactive, it may be something right now that we need to do.
Right, again, because of the times that we're in.
Yeah.
So again, we'll come to close. There'll probably be more to discuss tomorrow because stuff is breaking every day. But Russ was actually doing a little research today. I don't want to overlook this. I was waiting towards we come to the end of the video. But Russ has been finding out some good news, some actual numbers, and I kind of want to give this portion over to Russ to give us some reality. So, Russ, what's some of the most recent intel that you've been finding out?
Well, today, earlier when I was going through all of the news and stuff, the big thing that really seems to be on the horizon now, except for all of the bad news, which was, thousands and thousands of more cases, that was kind of expected because there was a backlog of tests and they're now getting those run through. So we knew that there was going to be a big spike. So that's bad news, but it's not as bad as it could be because we knew that was going to happen. The deaths today were at a steady over the whole course of this thing at 150 according to CDC. So that was bad. But what a lot of the news coverage was coming with out there is they've been running some trials of a very, very old medication that's turning out to be very efficacious in this. And I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to sell it. I'm just going to tell you what they said is that there was one study that they used it on 40 patients and they had 100% success with it. That's not to say that there's not going to be other hitches in the giddy up in this thing, but quinine. And so hydroxychloroquine is the name of it. They now make it synthetically. And I was out there doing some research on it. And so apparently, there may be a bright spot on the horizon. Maybe we're going to come out of this earlier than we thought we were. Maybe again, maybe not. Maybe we're going to have to wait for that vaccine. But right now, there is at least, hope.
Nice.
And hey, Connie, what's your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's great. I mean, it's not always about reinventing the wheel or trying to find something new. There are different medications that are out there that we've been using since the beginning of time that their efficacy has remained intact. I think it's just difficult when, we're not really thinking about using what we already have, and we're thinking we need to create something new, which also creates problems. I know I was watching something today, and one of the concerns that was raised is that they want people to self-quarantine and they want you to treat yourself when you're home. So like if you have a slight fever, like people might want to go and take an ibuprofen or something like that. And they were saying that just makes it worse if you have coronavirus. So like it's almost like not providing the guidance that people need in order to do self-care while they're in this quarantine. And how are we, like, what are we telling people to do is really the big question. So it's really good that they have something out there where they have done a trial and they're able to see some success, because that makes it a more hopeful picture.
Yeah, and that news we needed today. I was talking to Russ on the way home, and I've been under a lot of stress too, going back and forth to the job. So, it's taken a little bit of a toll on me, especially when we're being told it's not a matter of if, but when. So, you're kind of thinking like, oh shit, this thing's going to go through me at one point. And, it's just, I'm preparing myself for it, because you never know. And, it's just scary. It really is. Hey guys, in closing, we lost Andy. He had some bad weather out there. So I want to mention that. First of all, it was great having him on. You could look up the One Voice Initiative. They really do speak for all of frontline. Sometimes you may hear us say officer. It's because our background's officer. We mean frontline. We have respect for obviously anybody that works the frontline, especially today when they're making those sacrifices, all the essential employees. So please don't take as we say officer, we only mean officer. That's not the case. That's just sometimes that's just what comes out. But I promise you, we mean all of frontline. We appreciate you out there. We appreciate those sacrifices. And I did put the survey up. It's a pretty interesting survey. I took it. I'm sure Russ will take it. Connie will take it. It's up on my community board. And it's asking questions about your thoughts about what's going on with the coronavirus. And do you feel frontline is protected? So it'll be good for you guys to take those surveys. And guys, before we come to a close, before we get our final thoughts, I do want to say one thing. Some of the questions that I ask, I do want to be fair, and I do want to try to get the perspective of management. I don't want to just go towards the one side. I want to kind of understand why a certain decision has been made. I mean, I'm up in the management level all the time, and I see good people having to make tough choices, and sometimes it's just not understood by the front line, but sometimes these choices have to be made, and I don't think people see the bigger picture. So it's good to have a channel like this because we can provide hopefully an understanding which will eventually build a better connection between frontline and management. But sometimes the choices that you see management make, especially if you feel that it's such an obviously stupid choice, it's probably because we're forced to make that choice.
I was going to say it's probably not a choice.
Yeah, exactly. There you go, Connie. But yeah, I guess when you're forced to make a choice, it's not a choice. You're right.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I wish people would actually understand that a little bit more and, just kind of see it from the other perspective. So I think, when we have these dialogues, it's good for us to understand, yes, what we expect, but, well, why aren't we getting it? And that's where I think that we should maybe look at to the other side as well and be fair and objective, because sometimes it's not always as black and white as we would like it to be. Hey, Russ, what's your final thoughts, brother?
Yeah, I think it's great dialogue that we've had here. I think that in the end we're all going to be tested and hopefully come out better and more tempered and better prepared for the next the next hurdle that we're going to face. I think that's what corrections is about. It's about getting better prepared for each successive challenge that's thrown at us. I was really happy that we had Andy on here tonight. I'd never met him before. I had heard about, One Voice before, and I think it's going to be, really important for correctional staff across the United States to be able to use that venue in order to start, making some accountability with regards to protecting us from, attacks and gassings and some of the other hurdles we face. So I'm really excited about that. I'm looking forward to being able to, work with him in the future and to see more about what their website has to say. And so that really had me jazzed up, because I always want to make sure that we're pushing forward, safety and security for, everyone that works in corrections, and safety and security for the inmates as well.
Well, Russ, they're always looking for people to help spread the message. So I'll give you Andy's contact. I'm sure he would love to hear from you. Hey, Connie, what are some of your final thoughts?
I mean, the one thing I just wanted to go back to, which you had mentioned early on, I think we were offline at the time, was just the question about the gloves.
Oh, yeah.
So all gloves, I mean, especially vinyl gloves, they have a tendency to leak. And leaking gloves put the wearer at risk for hand contamination. So, I mean, I think we have to know that while gloves reduce hand contamination, they are not absolute barriers. And even when you finish using the gloves, take them off and still wash your hands. And so we know hand hygiene has been being pressed as the most important thing for us to maintain. And all I would just tell everyone is that continue to follow those universal precautions, washing hands constantly or as often as possible, and using the hand sanitizer that's at least 60% alcohol based.
Hey guys, this was a great show. What we're going to try to do is we'll probably try to do it again. We'll keep on top. I think that the key here is to get the information out there. Me, Russ, Connie, Louis Soto, we're doing a lot of reading. And if we feel that there's even just an ounce of information that has been out there before, we're running out there. We're putting it on. Forgive the internet. Internet's bad right now, but you never know. You never know. This could be an episode where you're watching and one day something happens in your facility and you're out there saying, hey, we just saw this. Can we try this? Because this is really what it is. It's trial and error. But I think that, the more we read, the more we do shows like this, the less error, and that's the key. I think what's been helping us out a lot is kind of reading up on the articles that are popping up on Corrections One, on Facebook, and then being able to do something like quickly here in case you don't have time to read all those articles. You could sit down and listen to this, at home or on your way to work, and just kind of be caught up to date on some of the measures that are taken. There's no secrets here with what's going on. There should be no protection of, basically this is information we all need. We should be sharing. And what's great, and I will say one thing, I have never seen corrections on a national level act so consistent as it's doing it right now. Usually corrections in all different states, it's not like police, there's policies and it's just everything's all different. You're trying to make an effort to get that one damn fit. This is the first time ever that we're seeing that, yes, we could be consistent. This could open up a door for a lot of other things when we talk about that law enforcement recognition. The fact that right now, we're all working together for that same mission. We should also be working together for that recognition as well, for those brave men and women that, wear that uniform and just don't get that recognition. And again, another shout out to our medical department, just for putting yourself right on that front line and doing what you can to protect us. And another shout out to all our essential employees like food service. Let's not get them overlooked. Maintenance, classification, mental health, and I don't know if I'm missing any, but you're essential and you're at work right now. Thank you. So as always, guys, the show is Tear Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Stay safe.